Most people spend years building the life they always wanted, and then they protect it at all costs. They don't walk away from it, they don't leave it behind, and they certainly don't look at everything they've built with their own two hands and say, "We're starting over." But that's exactly what Greg and Katie did. After years of backbreaking work, failed attempts, frozen pipes, and moments where the whole thing nearly fell apart, they abandoned the home they built from the ground up and made a move that left their entire audience stunned. Not a small tweak, not a renovation, a complete, total restart on 300 acres of raw, wildfire-scarred wilderness, 8 hours from everything they'd known. The comment sections lit up. Longtime viewers were confused, some were upset, and others couldn't believe what they were watching unfold in real time. A channel that had grown from almost nothing to nearly 200,000 subscribers had just flipped everything on its head. So how did a young couple living in a converted school bus end up at the center of one of the most talked about decisions in the homesteading community? And why did they do it? The answer is a lot more layered than it first appears. The story starts simply enough. Greg and Katie met as roommates, just two people who found themselves sharing a space and, eventually, a vision for something completely different. They weren't the type to dream about corner offices or city apartments. They wanted land. They wanted to build something real. Back in 2018, before Canadian property prices went completely off the rails, they made a move that would define the next decade of their lives. They bought a small plot of land in southeastern British Columbia, a province known for its rugged mountain terrain, dense forests, and winters that will genuinely test your resolve. The plan was straightforward: build a home, grow their own food, and live without depending on the grid for anything. At first, they were doing all of this from a converted school bus, what the van life crowd calls a schoolie. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable by conventional standards, but it was theirs, and it was the launch pad for everything that came next. What makes this detail important is the mindset behind it. Most people in their position would have stretched their budget for a starter home, taken on a 25-year mortgage, and played it safe. Greg and Katie looked at that option and rejected it entirely. They didn't want a forever home handed to them. They wanted to build one themselves, with their own hands, on their own terms. That philosophy would shape every single decision they made going forward. And it would eventually be the same philosophy that pushed them to do something nobody expected. When the channel launched in March 2020, the timing couldn't have been more interesting. The world was going into lockdown. People were stuck at home questioning every choice they'd ever made. And suddenly, a young Canadian couple building a cabin in the woods with almost no outside help looked incredibly appealing to a very large audience. The channel documented everything: the mistakes, the wins, the moments where Greg looked at a structural problem with the kind of expression that told you he was genuinely unsure how to fix it, and then figured it out anyway. Katie was just as hands-on, just as present on camera, and the dynamic between them gave the channel a warmth that a lot of homesteading content simply lacks. They built the cabin largely by themselves, minimal contractor involvement. Their solar setup powered a fridge, a freezer, a washing machine, and their laptops, all their own work. The power shed was built by hand, goat enclosures, vegetable gardens, the full infrastructure of a working off-grid property, all of it documented, warts and all. Viewers watched them work through every setback and every breakthrough over years of content, and that investment of attention created something powerful. The audience didn't just follow a channel, they became emotionally connected to that specific piece of land in British Columbia, to that specific cabin, which is exactly what made what came next so jarring. Before getting to the big move, there's a financial layer to this story that most casual viewers never fully registered, and it actually explains a lot about how Greg and Katie were able to do what they did. The channel grew steadily. Views accumulated, the subscriber count climbed, and the revenue streams quietly multiplied. They had a Patreon community contributing every month. They had merchandise, and the YouTube channel itself was generating real income, not life-changing money by industry standards, but enough to matter significantly when you're living simply and spending carefully. By 2024, independent estimates put the channel's combined net worth, factoring in both the property value and the online business, at around 1.6 million Canadian dollars. Two people who deliberately rejected consumerism, built their own home to avoid a mortgage, and chose goats over granite countertops had quietly become millionaires, not through inheritance or investment portfolios, but through the very lifestyle they were documenting. The channel was pulling in roughly 7,000 Canadian dollars per month through ad revenue alone, with Patreon and merchandise sitting on top of that. Katie in particular invested heavily in the channel's growth, treating it with the kind of focus you'd expect from someone running a serious media business, not a side hobby. This context matters because without it, the decision to purchase and move to a 300-acre property 8 hours away might look reckless. With it, it looks like something entirely different, a calculated expansion from two people who had done the math and knew exactly what they were capable of. But knowing the finances doesn't fully explain the emotional weight of the call they were about to make. After building a unique off-grid home on 10 acres, Greg and Katie announced they were leaving it behind, starting fresh on 300 acres of rugged, wildfire wilderness in northern British Columbia. 300 acres, wildfire country, 8 hours from where they'd spent years putting down roots. The reaction from the audience was immediate and divided. Longtime subscribers, the ones who'd been watching since the channel had just a few thousand followers, who'd seen every foundation pour and every solar panel install, weren't all celebrating. Some were genuinely unsettled. The comment sections filled with questions. What happens to the original cabin? Why now? Why leave something that took so long to build? Wasn't the whole point to build something permanent? For viewers who had followed the channel as a kind of escape from their own lives, a window into a simpler, more intentional way of living, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath them. The place they'd vicariously called home for years was suddenly being left behind. But Greg and Katie weren't framing it as abandonment. They were framing it as the next level. The school bus was phase 1, the 10-acre cabin was phase 2, and this raw, untamed, fire-scarred land the size of a small town was phase 3. Not everyone was convinced straight away. And honestly, looking at what they were walking into, the skepticism made complete sense. There's a romanticized version of what 300 acres in British Columbia sounds like, and then there's the reality of it. British Columbia has been hammered by wildfires in recent years. Entire communities have been displaced. Forests that took centuries to grow have been reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The land Greg and Katie purchased had been through it, described in their own words as rugged, wildfire wilderness. That's not marketing language. That's a warning. Starting a working homestead on land like that isn't a weekend project. It means clearing debris, assessing what's salvageable, and rebuilding soil health from scratch. It means establishing fencing across terrain that hasn't been properly managed in years, possibly decades. It means constructing a solar infrastructure on completely unfamiliar ground. It means navigating water sources, drainage systems, and the kind of bureaucratic headaches that British Columbia's complex land use and grazing laws throw at new property owners. Viewers in the comment sections flagged specific concerns almost immediately. Questions about grazing rights and legal easements that could complicate fencing decisions, warnings about solar setups failing on particle board frames in wet conditions, advice about which trees to plant near creek banks to prevent soil erosion. These weren't abstract worries, they were the kinds of practical obstacles that could derail months of work if not handled correctly from the start. And on top of all of that logistical complexity, Greg and Katie had to actually get to the new property first, with everything they owned. In the spring of 2025, they documented the move in full. 8 hours, an abandoned ranch, chaotic and stressful by their own admission. Moving a household is hard enough. Moving a functioning farm is something else entirely. Goats, equipment, solar hardware, tools, building materials, all of it had to be transported across hundreds of kilometers of British Columbia highway to a property that had no existing infrastructure waiting to receive it. There was no soft landing, no caretaker, no crew, nobody waiting on the other end, just raw land and whatever they could carry. During the move, while they were still in the process of setting up a basic campsite on the new property, a phone call came in that they hadn't wanted to receive. The details of what was on the other end of that call were kept private. But whatever it was, it landed during one of the most vulnerable moments of the entire transition, adding a layer of stress to a situation that was already running close to the edge. Plenty of creators would have turned the camera off at that point. Greg and Katie kept filming. That transparency, the willingness to show the chaos and the doubt right alongside the wins, is a significant part of why their audience stayed invested even through the confusion of the move. People weren't just watching a homestead being built, they were watching two real people navigating real uncertainty in real time. One long-time viewer, who mentioned they'd been watching since the channel had just 1,500 followers, captured what a lot of people were feeling, asking when the actual cabin build on the new land was going to start, worried they were running out of time before winter closed in. That anxiety was genuine, and it was shared widely across the comments. Work on the new property got underway immediately, and the scale of it became clear fast. One of the first major projects documented on the new land was the planting of 475 trees across the wildfire-affected property. Not a cosmetic gesture, a genuine reforestation effort that signals exactly how seriously Greg and Katie are approaching this land, not just as a place to live, but as something worth restoring over the long term. The infrastructure challenges are enormous. Their previous solar setup now needs to be rethought entirely for a much larger footprint. New fencing lines need to be established across terrain that stretches far beyond anything they've managed before. New animal enclosures, new water systems, new growing areas, all of it from scratch on land that is still in many areas recovering from fire damage. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, they still need to build a structure to actually live in. Because they didn't arrive at a finished home. They arrived at a starting point, just like they did back in 2018 when they first bought that plot of land and stepped out of a school bus with a plan and very little else. The contrast is almost hard to process. A school bus to a 10-acre cabin was already a remarkable leap. That 10-acre cabin to 300 acres of wildfire wilderness is something else altogether. The ambition has scaled up to match the land, vast, demanding, and full of unknowns. What Greg and Katie have figured out, or are actively in the process of figuring out, is that off-grid living at this level isn't a lifestyle decision you make once. It's a series of increasingly ambitious commitments, each one building on everything that came before. The school bus taught them the basics. The cabin taught them how to build for permanence. And this new land is teaching them something they couldn't have learned anywhere else: how to think about property not just as a place to live, but as something to steward and restore over decades. Whether the audience fully comes along for that, whether viewers who fell in love with the original cabin can emotionally invest in this new chapter, is a question the channel is still in the process of answering. Here's the thing about Greg and Katie's story that tends to get overlooked when people focus on the shock of the move itself. They were never just building a cabin. They were building a philosophy. The rejection of the mortgage, the willingness to live in a bus while the real work got underway, the decision to document the failures as openly as the wins, none of that was accidental. It was a consistent, deliberate pattern of choosing difficulty over comfort whenever the difficulty led somewhere meaningful. In an era when plenty of homesteading creators have quietly turned their simplicity into a very comfortable media business, upgrading behind the scenes while maintaining the appearance of roughing it on camera, Greg and Katie's lifestyle has genuinely matched what they document. Basic home, basic car, basic daily needs. The wealth that accumulated didn't change how they lived. It changed what they were able to attempt next. The decision to leave for 300 acres fits perfectly into that pattern. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a midlife crisis or a content strategy pivot. It was the logical next step for two people who have never once chosen the easier road when a harder, bigger option was available. And that's what made the audience reaction so interesting to watch. The people who were upset, the ones who felt like something had been taken from them, weren't wrong to feel that way. They genuinely invested years in that cabin, in those 10 acres, in that specific version of Greg and Katie's story. Watching it be set aside, even for something larger, is a real loss. That kind of attachment is what separates a channel people care about from one they just consume passively. But it's also a reminder of something this channel has always quietly been about underneath the build logs and the goat footage. The idea that you don't have to stay put just because you've already put in the work. That finishing something doesn't mean you're done. That the next chapter doesn't erase the last one. It's built on top of it, using everything the last one taught you. Most people never move once they've settled somewhere. They stay not because staying is still right, but because leaving feels like admitting failure. Greg and Katie looked at everything they'd accomplished, the cabin, the community, the income, the stability, and decided that comfort wasn't the point of any of it. Now they're 8 hours north, on 300 acres of recovering wilderness, planting trees on scorched ground, and working out the next version of something that started in a converted school bus. Whether you think it was the right call or not, the consistency of it is hard to argue with. Here's what this story ultimately comes down to. Two people started with nothing but a piece of raw land, a converted bus, and a stubborn belief that they could build something real without playing by anyone else's rules. They did exactly that. They built the cabin, grew the audience, turned a lifestyle into a legitimate business, and then, when most people would have sat back and finally relaxed, they looked at the horizon and decided it wasn't enough yet. The off-grid world is full of people who talk about freedom and self-reliance. Greg and Katie are two of the rare ones who actually practice it, even when practicing it means walking away from the very thing that made them who they are. The question that their audience is quietly wrestling with right now, whether they realize it or not, isn't really about the land. It's something more personal. What does it take to leave behind something you've poured yourself into, not because it failed, but because something bigger is calling you forward? And what does it say about you if you never find out? Greg and Katie already know their answer. 300 acres of wildfire wilderness in northern British Columbia is all the proof you need.